I mean, the rate of change is so powerful, so rapid, so complex on so many different levels that we have to see that there's no way that we can anticipate what our children are going to need 20 years from now, 15 years from now. We can say that there's certain foundational things that they need, but there's nothing that we can say that they need for sure that's more important than their healthy ability to learn whatever they need to learn when they get there. But our education system is in no way organized around stewarding how healthy they can learn in general. It subordinates that completely to what we think they should learn and how we think they should learn it. So the main point to take away from here is we can no longer, by virtue of all these forces of change, we can no longer assume that what we think they should learn is more important than how well they can learn. And once we get onto that, then we start to enter the conversation of what we call stewarding the health of learning. And you think about it, what's more important? What do you think? Does anybody think there's something more important for children than the general health of their learning? Anybody?
Maybe what they eat.
Okay. All right. For the most part, other than when that's controlled, that's also learned. I mean, their eating habits and behavior. If you diagnose and look into eating disorders, at the root, they're maladaptive learning, right? But yeah, go ahead.
Are you including like their attitudes,
which of their attitudes aren't learned?
Well, I meant their self-esteem.
With their self-esteem, what aspect of their self-esteem isn't learned?
Oh, yeah, it is. I mean, are you including that?
I'm including all of it. Yeah, I'm saying we are learned. There's very little of us that's not learned in terms of how we inhabit our bodies, how we learn to modulate ourselves emotionally, how we learn to interact with others, how we learn to play with each other or not with each other. You know, all of these things are learned, and that they're more reflective of the general health of how we're learning than they are in what we're being taught per se, right? So this is a different mission for education, to be focused on the general health of learning rather than on the particular things. It's not that we're not concerned with the particular things. It's not we're throwing out curriculum and content. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying that the purpose of curricular content is to exercise the general health of learning rather than to forget about the general health of learning and cram the curricular content. Different mission. In order to start concern ourselves with the health of learning, we have to understand that learning has a dark side. How many of you work with struggling learners? Okay. If you think about when you're up on the edge with them and what they're struggling with, how much of what they're struggling with is an innate learning problem, and how much of what you're struggling with is what they've learned in the past working against them learning now? I mean, how many parents can answer that with respect to their own children? I mean, the majority of our learning problems are a consequence of our learning. That's my point. Learning can be both positive, and it can also be incredibly negative. It can also be very maladaptive. Learning can lead us both cognitively and emotionally off the rails. In order to actually create a situation where we're inspiring and resourcing and supporting more healthy learning, we have to be able to see and read and intervene on the unhealthy learning that's going on in children. So we have to be able to be sensitive to it. And for the most part, we don't make it. How many people heard of unhealthy learning before tonight? That many? You did. I know you did. Right? So unhealthy learning is not very much part of our conversation. And yet, when we look at it, it's very clear that unhealthy learning is running amok in our world, costing us $1 trillion worth of the healthcare problem, as well as we could go on and on to how it manifests itself in our world. All the time while us adults are rather oblivious to this happening. So that's one dimension. That's one really important dimension. The other important dimension to really get about the healthy learning, about trying to be stewards and to be caring for the learning that's going on in our fellows and particularly in our children, is to recognize a distinction between artificial learning and natural learning. How many people have heard of artificial learning? You know that you have. Do you know that most of the time you spend in artificial learning land rather than in natural learning land? I mean, you get that, right? Let's go into that for a moment. So, human beings Whether you consider us endowed this way or evolved this way, we are exquisite. We are the universe's optimal, best known learners as individuals and as collective, as teams, as groups, as families. But the kind of learning that caused us to come to the pinnacle, if you will, in nature as learners is learning that happens on the living edge of now. Right? We learn to run, to walk, to talk, to listen, to speak, to manipulate fine objects with ever greater motor skill, dexterity. All of those things happen now. Right? When I fall and tumble down, it happens right now. I feel it right now. If I'm trying to manipulate some tool or rock or toy, I feel it right now. When I do something, I can see it. I can feel it. It's right now. When I'm learning to listen to a language as a little child and come into the language world of my parents, it's happening right now. I'm right on the edge of right now. Now, the interesting thing is in all these cases, if I'm a baby and I'm trying to learn to walk and I start to fall and my nervous system doesn't report on it for a quarter of a second, I would never learn to walk. I mean, my organism is wired to pay attention to the edge of right now all the time. And our children are miraculously, enormously, incredibly, beautifully empowered to do that, to come into the natural world of right now, learn their way into that. Emotionally, in relationships, inside the language environments they're born into, inside the toys they get to play with, they're masterful at that. And that's organically part of who they are to be able to do that. And it's based on this feedback. Their organism's wired to be paying attention to the feedback at the very edge of what they're doing. So they do something, they feel it. They do something, they feel it, and through that they extend into the world. The problem is the rest of the world doesn't work that way anymore. The world that us adults inhabit is full of not now, not present, abstract importances that are not relatable to the child in the same way that the natural world is. And the best example of that, and now we segue into our main point, is reading. So what is reading? I submit to you that it is a code-informed and instructed virtual reality experience. It is a artificially inseminated language experience. It's an artificially simulated stream of simulated language experiences that wouldn't happen if it wasn't for the way that the brain, in a very machine-like way, was trained to be able to interpret an artificial technological artifact and translate it into a projected experience that approximated what they hear when they talk with other human beings. And the key point to take away relative to the theme of tonight's conversation is that not only are children experiencing artificial learning challenges that are artificial to their organism, to the way that their organism wants to process the world, but we have, as parents, as educators, as peers, we've created an environment in which children feel, the children that struggle with this, as if the struggle is a reflection of something wrong with them. As if their difficulties with taking off in these artificial worlds are not a consequence of how much talk time they've got with their parents when they were babies. It's not a consequence of their emotional, any one of hundreds of factors that are involved in why a child might have difficulty with reading. The child's experience of a difficulty is something's wrong with me. So here we have 5, 6, 7-year-old children forming this internal sense of themselves as having something wrong with their minds because of their difficulty with this. And it skews their trajectory in life profoundly. If there was one thing to take away out of everything that we talk about tonight, is probably this, that just like reading has to be this faster than you can think about it unconscious process. You know what I mean? Reading, you can't stop and think about how does this work and that work. If you do, the whole thing stops. Right? Reading has to happen like this automatic stream underneath of processing. So what happens at that automatic unconscious level when your mind starts to develop an avoidance of confusion? What happens when you become shame-averse to the feeling of confusion? What happens to your trajectory of learning in life when learning itself, even before you can even rationalize it and think about it, when as soon as you approach a learning situation, it causes this confusion, and this confusion triggers the shame, and unconscious to you, you're already moving out of there. What happens to your life? This is why reading correlates with social pathologies, not because somebody can't read the instructions the right way or didn't read the right books. It's that protracted difficulty with learning to read causes unconscious shame, causes children to develop these unconscious shame avoidance behaviors with respect to learning, which decapitates and shuts down their learning more generally, which results in what happens when you don't have an internal compass you can trust to navigate the world with, to learn your way into all the complex other things that happen in life, when you can't trust that in yourself. It's mind shame. Mind shame, being ashamed of your mind. What happens when you become ashamed of your mind? What happens when you become ashamed of learning? Yeah, I mean, we avoid the things that cause us to feel shame of ourselves. What happens when learning causes us to feel shame? And how many people do you know, if when you think about it, when you look at what's going on with them, you can see that. You can see that what's going on for them is that they have unconsciously acquired this trigger that as they approach a confusing situation, rather than feeling confident in their ability to learn their way through it, they feel confused, and the confusion triggers the shame, and they want to get out of there.